It's that time of year. Everybody's making their USMLE study resolutions. But while most people are promising to study more or try harder, I'm here to show you what actually works. Having coached more students to 260 plus scores than anyone I've ever encountered, including students who previously failed, I know exactly what separates wishful thinking from real results. Today, I'm breaking down my top 10 strategies that transformed struggling students into 260 plus scores. Let's dive in. Number 10 is eliminate, don't reduce. The psychology behind absolutes is that it's a lot easier to do something always or never than to do it only sometimes. When you eliminate options, you actually are eliminating the mental energy of deciding. Think Silicon Valley CEOs who always wear the exact same thing, or how it's easier to just cut out social media entirely rather than trying to just cut it down. As someone who lived most of their life without realizing that they had ADHD, I've had a lot of trouble with maintaining self-control. One of the most important things to do if you want to score 260 plus is to be consistent. And in order to do that, one of the most important ways to set yourself up for success is to eliminate things that are going to get in your way. For example, I didn't own a smartphone through all of medical school and most of residency. The reason being, I knew I had poor self-control, and as such, I knew that if I had a phone that had access to the internet and social media and all of these other things, that I would just continue to just scroll or check my email rather than doing the hard work of actually studying. So I just didn't even give myself the option. I had an iPod Touch that allowed me to access the internet when I had access to Wi-Fi, but when I was commuting on the subway or the bus, I eliminated the possibility of being distracted, and instead, I ended up studying a lot more. For you, ask yourself, what are the things that are getting in your way where if you just eliminated them completely from your life, you would get a lot more done. Number 9 is to master conceptual thinking. There are a lot of details that you have to know about medicine. One of the best strategies I know to learn things faster and remember them better, as well as get more questions correct on your exams, is to master things conceptually first so that you can see the pattern underneath all of those details. For example, chronic inflammation leads to fibrosis. That's the major cause of any time you see a scar or something like that. This is one concept that explains everything from heart failure scars to transplant rejection. This is how top scorers think. One of the things that you have to know for the USMLEs is that a couple weeks after an MI, you end up with scarring. Another thing you'll find is that chronic transplant rejection, you'll see fibrosis. In addition, in things like coronary artery disease, you get a fibrous cap. Now, you could memorize all of those individual facts, or you could just recognize that underneath them is one fundamental principle. And that principle is that chronic inflammation leads to fibrosis. And so anytime you see fibrosis, you can just ask yourself, okay, well, let's see if there's chronic inflammation. And what do you know? There usually is. This helps because you'll not only recognize patterns across systems, you're gonna make connections between different diseases. And anytime you get a new disease that they're going to show you on your test, it's going to become easier because you'll be able to see the concept beneath all of the new details. Finally, you're gonna remember things so much more easily, and you're going to end up with a lot more time on your hands. Number 8 is to build your get done muscle. One of the reasons that we will all struggle in achieving our goals in 2025 is because of procrastination. Procrastination at core is really just a modern version of the fight or flight reflex. If you think about it, there's millions of years of evolution that have honed us to see any sort of threat, be it a lion or a scary block on UWorld because we've been getting low scores up until this point, and any of those things evoke the same fight or flight response, which in modern terms just means maybe you're scrolling your phone or using social media or whatever. The hard truth is that ultimately you gotta feelings and follow the plan, which means that you have to separate your feelings from your actions. Let me explain how to do this. Step number 1 is to identify the feeling itself. For example, if I know that I need to do practice questions, but I'm like, oh my gosh, I really don't want to do this, then maybe what I would say is something like, okay, I get it, you feel really anxious right now. Second, you want to validate your feelings without surrendering to them. It makes sense that you're going to feel anxious anytime you even think about doing questions. This means you have to separate your feelings from your actions. I would say something like, yeah, it makes sense, I don't really want to do this. However, I know that I am capable of doing this, therefore I am going to honor my commitment rather than my comfort. Strategy number 7 is to create unavoidable accountability. Studies have shown, for example, that people that weigh themselves every single day lose more weight than people that don't weigh themselves. It makes sense. What you track, you're naturally going to pay more attention to. This works even better if you do it publicly. What you want to do is find some kind of accountability partner. For people that we coach, we ask them to send daily what their statistics are for the things that they want to improve. Typically, this is going to be the number of Anki Anki cards that they make, the number of Cuban questions that they do, the number of lectures or videos that they're going through, basically anything they want to do more of. Not only do we want them to show us the record for that day, we want them to show the record for the last 10 to 20 days. That way, there's no room for excuses or rationalization. If you want to take this to the next level, you can even have a penalty if you don't do your check-in. So for example, you could say something like, hey, if I don't send in my stats by 6 p.m. tonight, I will buy you coffee tomorrow. Something simple like that. Number 6 is to break free from memorization. The most critical mindset shift for people who score high on the USMLEs don't test what you know. They test if you can use what you know in new situations. There was a student I spoke with recently who failed step 1 3 times despite being excellent at his classes. He knew he was very good at memorization and could recite all of the facts, but what he found is that he had a problem with transfer. Transfer means if I know something in one context, can I use it in another? If you can't transfer your knowledge, it essentially is staying locked in the original context, and you can't use it when the details change in the new one. You may see this yourself if you're getting questions wrong despite knowing the answer. In other words, if you look at the answer explanation, you realize, oh my gosh, like I knew that, or I knew most of that, and yet you still got it wrong. The key here is to focus on understanding why things are, not just on remembering the details. That, and to recognize that in order to solve problems of transfer, what you need to do is to apply your knowledge in new context as many times as possible. Therefore, when you're faced with new situations on the USMLEs, you'll be well practiced to transfer the concepts and principles that you've already been applying. Number 5 is to set goals that scare you. One of the reasons why setting average goals leads to average results is that if you're just aiming to pass, you're not going to get up at 5 a.m. But if you're aiming for a 260 or 270, you'll find the motivation. One of the problems I've found in my life is that if I set an incremental goal, meaning like I want just to be a little bit better than I was before, I can convince myself that I can continue to do the same things that I've been doing and just do them maybe a little bit more or just a little bit better. While I do agree that compounding small gains over time can lead to large results, what I've also found is that transformation happens best when I have a really aspirational goal to motivate me. When I set high goals, it makes it a lot easier for me to say no to certain things. Like for example, if I know that I want to score really high, it's a lot easier for me to say no to staying up late. It also makes me look for quantum leap improvements in my approach so that I can get on track with my new goal. So ask yourself, where are you shying away from setting big goals? Maybe it's in the specialty that you're pursuing, maybe it's in the USMLE score that you want, maybe it's in the location that you want to end up for residency. Find where you're selling yourself short, and then ask yourself, okay, if I had a magic wand and I could get anything that I wanted without worrying about whether it was possible or whether it was likely or not, what would I ask for? And then reverse engineer, what is it going to take to get there? Number 4 is to choose mentors by achievement over proximity. While it's convenient, don't seek advice from those closest to you. Instead, seek it from those that are closest to the goals that you want to achieve. In other words, if you want to score a 260 or 270 on the USMLEs, try and find people who have done that thing and then figure out what it is that they did, instead of looking around at your immediate circle and trying to figure out what they're doing. This matters because there are 2 kinds of problems that you have. The first kind of problem is the problem that you can see. These would be things like, I have a problem covering a lot of material, or I have a problem with remembering things. These are big problems because if you know that you have the problem but you haven't yet solved it, by definition that means it's a big problem. In contrast, there's also what we call blind spot problems. These are ones that you're not even aware of yet. As an example, I was coaching a student recently and he said, I have a problem with time management. I will work really, really hard on Saturday, but then on Sunday, because I worked so hard on Saturday, it is hard for me to get more done on Sunday. And so maybe I'll only work like an hour or 2. Because I have been through this myself, and because I've coached lots of people through this problem, his problem actually isn't what he thinks. Is it really a time management problem, or is it a problem that when you're studying, you're not seeing yourself improve? And he said, what do you mean by that? What I mean by this is that people often confuse a problem of not seeing their scores go up or not seeing results with not having motivation. The way that you know that this is a problem is that if every single time you studied, you scored 80 or 90, even 100% on the things that you were learning, your problem isn't fundamentally that you're not motivated. Your problem is fundamentally that you're not seeing results for the work that you're putting in, and therefore it makes sense that you don't want to put in a lot more work. For this student, this was a blind spot. He was focused on the symptom of having a hard time motivating himself and not realizing that that lack of motivation was coming from the fact that he was just struggling. Number 3 is to become a morning study master. My promise of 2025 is that if you study for 2 hours before going trying to work, you're gonna get twice as much done as if you try to study for 2 hours after you come home exhausted. Obviously, there's a caveat that you need to get enough sleep. If you study with a fresh mind, you will have better retention, better learning, and better results. I like staying up late. It's kind of nice. Like it's nice because there's not a lot of distractions. I still made myself into a morning person throughout medical school and residency. And the reason for this is because I knew that hospital work tends to start very early in the morning. Because of this, I knew that I wouldn't have the option of staying up really, really late to do my work. So especially on days when I only had an hour or two to study, I wanted to make sure that I got the most out of that time. For example, as soon as I shifted doing Anki cards to early in the day as opposed to later in the day, I was doing twice as many cards in less time. The same thing holds for anything, but especially the things that require a lot of mental energy. And if you're like me and you're like, oh my gosh, waking up early is super painful, I just remind myself that the pain of not achieving my goal is actually worse than the pain of me actually just waking up early. Number 2 is to never forget what you learn. Most of you at this point have heard about Anki or spaced repetition. Many of you have tried it, and a lot of you have found conclusion that maybe it's not for you, or it's just not working, or something like that. But the key is, don't use pre-made decks that test facts. Instead, create your own cards that test concepts. This is a very controversial opinion, I know, because it's really convenient and even reassuring to have the idea that someone has just made a deck of all of the things that I need to know, and it's comprehensive, and other people have used it to score high. The downsides that people don't usually tell you is that they are almost always focused on facts over concepts. Because everything has to be memorized like a detail, this leads to an overwhelming number of cards. Last time I checked, one popular pre-made deck that many medical students use has over 50,000 cards. Over the last 15 years of making my own Anki cards, I've made a little more than 20,000 cards. That was over 5 years at Stanford for medical school, 4 years at Harvard MGH for residency, and the subsequent time since graduating. The reason why I've been able to retain so much more information using fewer cards is because I don't have to memorize everything like a detail. And because I'm making my own cards, I can tailor them to the things that I don't know, rather than trying to cover everything equally. And my number 1 tip to crush the USMLEs in 2025 is to become a question mind reader. To do this, you have to strip questions to their core concepts. Stop memorizing presentations and start understanding the concept that they're really testing. For example, there was one USMLE style question: patient had a massive pulmonary embolism. The question was something like, what would you see on an echocardiogram in this patient? Now, the student that I was working with said something like, oh man, I don't know that detail. Like, that sounds very, very specific. The reason why this student had zero idea what the question was asking is because they didn't understand the concept. The concept was actually really simple: preload, afterload contractility. Specifically, that a pulmonary embolism that blocks off one of the branches of the pulmonary artery is going to lead to an increase in afterload. In other words, you're going to increase the resistance to flow of blood from the heart. So really what the question is asking is, if I were to squeeze off the pulmonary artery, what would it look like in the heart? If you see the question conceptually, it's a lot easier to figure out what they're asking. In order to see concepts better, first you have to make sure that you learn the concepts in the first place, like we talked about previously. Second, when you're reading questions, practice seeing the concepts behind the questions, whether they're testing you on it directly or not. And if you're looking for more help on how to get into the mind of the test writers, be sure to check out our instant zero study score boosters to help you learn how to master the question interpretation aspects of the exam. These strategies work. I've seen them transform even failing students into 260+ scores. If you want to see how to apply these specifically to step 1 and step 2, check out my video, How to Score 270+ by Mastering Step 1 versus Step 2 Differences.